Guten Morgen, meine Damen und Herren. Ganz herzlich willkommen zum ersten Panel dieses Tages. Wir werden jetzt auf Englisch weitermachen, damit wir hier eine gemeinsame Sprache auf dem Panel haben. So, a very warm welcome to all of you. Very good to have you here. The era of confrontation and division of Europe has ended. We declare that henceforth our relations will be founded on respect and cooperation. Full stop. Don't worry, you haven't missed the great Russian-European reconciliation overnight. No, this is a quote that dates back to the Charter of Paris, in fact. The charter which was adopted almost exactly to this day 27 years ago in November 1919, notably by the Soviet Union at the time and most of NATO's member states. What is left of the spirit of Paris? Do we still have some form of common ground, or do the differences actually outweigh what we at least believe we would share? These are some of the questions that we are going to discuss on this panel this morning. And Mr. Chizhov, let's kick off this conversation together. You are known, if I may say so, as a staunch supporter of the idea that Russia should be a European power. The only problem is that by far not all of your compatriots actually share this view. And as we just heard, only 1 in 2 Russians actually believes that, yes, Russia is part of Europe. So why is that?
Well, I believe the figures that were shown, I don't know how representative the poll was
Very
in Russia. Was it on Moscow and St. Petersburg?
No,
did you go to the Far East, where you would get a slightly different view? To this, I can quote a prominent figure of the European Union several years ago, when 2009, we had a Russia-EU summit in Khabarovsk. And he admitted, looking at the European Union from here, I see it's just a small peninsula. So I believe the results reflect a mutual confusion. On the EU side, be it Germany or Poland, or any other EU member state, the prevailing view is to equate EU and Europe. So when people are asked whether Russia is in Europe, people start thinking whether Russia is in the EU, and it is not. Actually, the same thing might be happening on the Russian side, because this would be a reaction that Europe is equated with the European Union, and the European Union, with all its policies of the last few years, is not, shall I try to be politically correct, is not the shining temple up on the hill.
Not anymore. So, you talked about confusion, Mr. Ambassador, but one of the explanations for the result could at least also be that from a Russian point of view, official Russian rhetoric in recent years was a lot about this pivot to Eurasia, all these great new partnerships in Asia, and there was a sense that Europe and the EU, to some extent, have become irrelevant for Moscow. So that kind of narrative seems to be trickling down to public opinion in Russia. That could be one explanation, couldn't it?
Actually, the term pivot was not created in Russia. It was created elsewhere, in the Asian
Let's call
context.
it a rebalancing to Eurasia.
It's not rebalancing. The official Russian line, and I will be strict describing it, is that Russia is open for cooperation both to the West and to the East, which is actually reflected on the state seal of Russia, the double-headed eagle, looking both ways. Yes, we've seen, against the background of Russia-EU partnership sort of dragging its feet, we've seen much more dynamic development of Eurasian integration. So my immediate task these days is to try to convince the European Union, my interlocutors in Brussels and elsewhere, that it's high time for these two integrations to come together, not join in a single effort, but at least to establish contacts between the two unions and the two commissions. And I must admit that the Eurasian Economic Commission, and more broadly the Eurasian Economic Union, were built very much along the same lines, the same regulation patterns and so on as the European Union. Moreover, we've taken careful note of the experience of the European Union, both positive and negative, trying to use the positive and not to repeat the negative.
That's a good way to proceed. I want to come back to the issue of these two maybe competitive regional integration projects later on. But Mr. Cimoszewicz, let's have a look once again at the poll. One of the things that surprised me was that a relatively large share of people in Poland believe that, yes, Russia is part of Europe, 57%. Was that something which surprised you as well?
Not at all, I must say, because it is quite understandable. Of course, at least some people know geography, and at least some people know history. Because, you know, we were friends and we were foes, we were enemies, not with an Asian power, but with European power for centuries. But speaking very seriously, people perceive Russia still through the life experience when Russia was so important, so active in European affairs, and played significant role in European affairs. Some still believe, some still remember the times of, let's say, Soviet bloc and, let's say, Warsaw Pact, etc., etc. So for many Poles, Russia was and is a European country. Of course, the truth is that it is a very specific example on a global scale, because there is no another one country so large and located on both continents. And it is, of course, quite understandable, at least from my perspective, that Russia has become more focused on the Asian dimension of its relations. That's normal with growing powers in Asia. I understand that very well. But let me add also some probably kind of negative motivation for that change in Russian foreign politics. That was very embarrassing to follow some statements, some positions presented by Russian leaders starting already several years ago, when they presented what I would call a kind of anti-Western attitude. The most famous example probably of that was a speech by President Putin at Munich Security Conference in 2007. But there were some other examples of very similar character. So with that kind of perception, perceiving the West as at least not a friendly partner, or even as an enemy. Let me remind all of us that when in 2010, I believe, NATO adopted a new defense doctrine, Russia was mentioned there as a partner. In the same time, in a similar Russian document, NATO was mentioned as an enemy. So I believe that that way of perceiving the West, including Europe, including European Union, doesn't help or didn't help, has not helped to build, construct a well-balanced policy. And with those very, very unfortunate events which took place in 2014 with the Russian attack against Ukraine, of course, the situation became much more complicated and very difficult.
We'll come back to Ukraine later on, but let's have a look at the figures of the poll for a moment. We've seen that 57%, as you said, of Poles think Russia is part of Europe. 88% are in favor of rapprochement between Europe and Russia. So my question to you would be, Mr. Cimoszewicz, Poland within the EU context and other political contexts is a country which is rather tough on Russia. These figures from the Polish population seem to indicate that there is a stronger inclination towards rapprochement. So do you think that Polish politicians are tougher on Russia than their population wants them to be?
But if I'm correct, the same polls show that 58% of Polish people support continuing sanctions against Russia. So this is not paradox. This is not a kind of paradox, because nobody is happy with deterioration of our relations with Russia. However, that was unavoidable reaction to the events of 2014. And especially from Polish perspective, I believe that that perspective should be shared by everybody in Europe. Respect for basic norms of relations between the states, non-use of force, non-use of power, respect for the post-war borders, etc., should be treated as something basic. And the Poles are the last nation that could neglect that kind of events. You know very well the controversies over decades between Poland and Germany concerning our western border. And Poles used to be very sensitive when it comes to discussion about territorial changes in Europe. And I think that all lessons, history lessons, show us that we should be extremely serious about events like that. So nobody is happy with bad relations nowadays with Russia. These are Polish apple producers who cannot export their apples to Russia. We have become the biggest producer and exporter of apples in the world, and Russia was the biggest market for us. Let me tell you that the burden of sanctions, anti-Russian sanctions, in Poland is relatively heavier than for German business. We pay higher price for that. But still, many people, I believe, majority of the people believe that we had to react. And with no changes in Russian policy, that unfortunately has to be continued.
So the buzzword here is norms, Frau Gloger. In your new book, which is called Fremde Freunde, which translates into alien friends, I would say. Kind of. You also try to explore whether we still have a common set of values with Russia. So what conclusion do you reach?
Let me get back to the poem one more time. What I found very interesting is that the majority of people in all three countries you've been asking sees Ukraine, the development, the annexation of Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine as a reason for the growing conflict. I fear that the reasons go way deeper. They show a growing alienation between Europe, if I may put it as a normative concept, a certain set of values in a certain geographical area, and Russia, a growing alienation when it comes to certain values that societies should follow and live upon. And the notion that Russia is leaving the West started already 10 years ago with Putin's famous speech in Munich, but also with the growing divide between Russia and the West, being Europe part of this Western world. I think this is a fact we have to face, that this divide is really there. It's not diminishing, it's growing. And this puts us as Europe into a situation and the question how to manage an adversarial relationship and how to manage a conflict between our countries. That's what I fear we are facing right now.
Mm-hmm. And do you have an answer to that question? I mean, how should we manage this difficult relationship right now? I mean, it's a super big question, I know,
yes.
But give it a try. Give it a try.
One answer might be patient resolve, to reassure our Western partners and countries, reassurance also with help of NATO, of our defense alliance, keeping every door we can open to Russia, signaling that we want to live in friendship and we want to pursue kind of a common policy when it comes to living together in this geographical area with so much burden of history. So trying to keep every possible door open on a governmental level, but even more so on a civil society level. We heard yesterday that there is a nucleus, there is a civil society growing in Russia. You have a new and a younger generation also growing in Russia. And keeping these contacts alive, trying to find points of common interest and developing them, I think this might be one part of the answer. So it's hard power and soft power.
Ambassador,
I hope I'm not too wrong. Diplomats were no more.
Yeah, let me just to sort of throw one thought in here. Both Mr. Cimoszewicz and also Frau Gloger mentioned the issue of Russia somehow turning away from the West. And it was your foreign minister who this year in Munich said that he's hoping that the world will opt for a post-Western global order. So help us understand this shift in Russian thinking.
I think this is the only equipment that fits my presentation.
A strong stick.
Before I do that, let me react to something the other members here on the panel said. Well, Mr. Cimoszewicz referred to anti-Western rhetoric. Well, I would say this is child's play compared to anti-Russian rhetoric in the West, both in Europe and particularly in the United States. Okay, in the US, it's driven by domestic issues. The result of the election a year ago and attempts to put the blame on somebody else, and Russia seen as a soft target in that respect. I also need to rectify one thing. In no Russian official document was NATO described as an enemy. No. The phraseology was that NATO eastward expansion is a challenge to Russian national security. And that's, well, I'm quoting approximately, of course, on the basis of my memory, but I do remember those documents being involved in their preparation. Yes, on the apples. Actually, among the figures in your poll, I don't know if you've noticed that the percentage of Russians who believe the sanctions should be maintained has actually increased. And it's 24-something. I can tell you the reason. In spite of what Barack Obama was saying about Russian economy being in shatters, Russian economy has not only survived and adapted itself, not without a price, of course, but still. But if you ask Russian apple producers or other people involved in agriculture, they would say, please President Putin, the government, please make sure the sanctions continue. Because this is the way for the Russian agriculture to survive long term. The reason being, let me just in a couple of words describe you the sequence of events. When the Soviet Union collapsed, a huge food market opened in Russia. And without any real competition from domestic producers, EU exporters grabbed it, to put it bluntly. The figures went up from 2 billion euros a year to 12 and then to 14 billion. Against the well-known figures of the EU subsidizing beef at 26%, butter at 34%, how, logically speaking, could a Russian domestic producer compete with them? So now they have a chance. This is not to say that I personally would insist on the sanctions to be continued, because it is poisoning Russia-EU cooperation in various fields. On what to do next, I would advise not to count much on NATO for reassurance.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, you speak that we need to live in peace and cooperate. But, it's now NATO that is naming Russia as the enemy. Well, as the adversary. But no longer as a partner.
Let's not get into this sort of game of blaming each other. Let's think about constructive ways of how we can get out of this spiral, of blaming each other. What's a constructive way forward? And when you talk about sanctions and not wanting them to be kept in place, what is the one thing that Russia can do to help end the sanctions regime? And I mean, some obvious things would be on the table, aren't there?
Well, I think this is a cul-de-sac where the EU has driven itself on the advice of some others, like those, and should I quote, we had to twist their arms, the Europeans' arms. That was Joe Biden. So it's up to the European Union to gather the political will it needs, create, I would say, a critical mass of political will to change its course. And when it does, and I hope that happens sooner rather than later, the EU will know where to find us.
And what can Russia do? What is a constructive step on the Russian part?
We can be patient and wait to see the EU admit its mistakes and change its course.
Well, Frau Gloger, is that an answer that satisfies you?
We are all humans, we all make mistakes. And if we look at the last 20 years of our relationship, when it comes to the 90s, I mean, there are lots of reasons, so to say, to blame each other and to numberize all those mistakes. On the other hand, there must be a point at a certain time where this is over and we really need to go forward. And one way, for example, of going forward would be for Russia, if I might give this thought into the discussion, could or would be for Russia to overcome its structural backwardness, its structural economical backwardness over time, which I think is a very big risk in the very end for Russia's foreign policy and for Russia's standing in the world. Russia becoming a strong partner when it comes to structural reforms, economy, the rule of law, and so on and so forth, this would be a wonderful way forward to come to a new partnership, or to a partnership on a new level between Russia and the European Union. And it would also help Poland to export more apples again.
And the sanctions policy is supposed to help that.
Sanctions are always a bad measurement, I think, are always a bad thing to do, but sometimes there is no other solution. I mean, after the annexation of Crimea and the events unfolding in eastern Ukraine, the West
choose your words about Crimea.
The West had to find an answer, hadn't it?
What would also be a wonderful way forward in terms of the sanctions is to fully implement the Minsk agreement, as we all know. So, Mr. Cimoszewicz, what is your sense? We've seen that most of the people, the respondents in Russia, in Poland, and also in Germany believe that the one cause for the tensions between Russia and Europe is the Ukraine crisis. From your point of view, what is the trajectory in that conflict? What's the way forward?
First, let me say that those events of 2014, annexation of Crimea, or an attempt to annex that part of Ukrainian territory to Russia, the continuous intervention in eastern Ukraine should be treated as a very important and very negative event or series of events. And we have absolutely no right to neglect that. Speaking about sanctions, we have to understand that they had at least two targets, played double role. First, we simply could not react to the act of aggression in Europe. Otherwise, European community, European Union, would lose our identity as a community sharing some basic fundamental principles of rule of law. And we just had to react. And without changing the situation there in the field, we have no space for maneuver. If that was a minor event, if that was a minor sin, as it happens very often in politics, we could be more opportunistic, close our eyes, and one day say, okay, let's make business as usual. Not in this particular case. So Mr. Ambassador Chizhov's answer that Russia can continue to be patient is not a solution at all. It is, of course, not my duty or right to shape Russian politics, but let me tell you, as someone who has been involved in looking for a kind of dialogue between my country and Russia, Europe and Russia. I'm a member of a group, Europe-Russia Dialogue, established by Chizhov and Chubais. And at one of the last meetings, during one of the last meetings in Moscow, I said that was Chatham House rule meeting, but I can quote myself. I said that.
That's a good way.
In my opinion, a Russian policy is suicidal, because in long term, I cannot understand which way Russia is going to strengthen its economy, to modernize its economy, to make it more competitive. When 4 years ago I attended so-called Valdai Club conference, all of the Russian leaders, including Mr. Putin, repeated that Russian economy is not competitive. And nothing has changed in that regard. From the point of view of historical interests of Russia, it has to change that. With whom? If not with West European countries, with United States, Japan, etc.
Thank you. Ambassador,
I have to react.
I would like you to respond and tell us whether you really think that Russia can afford to be just patient and wait for others to make more mistakes.
Well, I think my reference to patience has been somewhat misinterpreted. But let me start by referring to the notion that Europe had to do something when events happened in Ukraine in 2014. Well, Europe did something. Europe became complicit to the coup d'etat in Kiev. And 3 foreign ministers, 2 of those countries are represented on the panel, signed a deal only to throw it into the waste bin next morning. So before you refer to aggression in that context, I would suggest that you read the description of the notion of aggression in international law. What Russia has been doing when the Ukraine crisis erupted had nothing to do with that. Yes, speaking of patience, I referred to Russia-EU cooperation. When we speak about Ukraine, of course, Russia is active, both in the Normandy format, along bilateral channels. You know that Russia continues to be the largest investor in Ukrainian economy. Speaking of competitiveness. Yes, I will agree that Russian economy needs further streamlining, further economic reforms, less reliance on energy exports and so on. I think everybody would agree to that. What the EU is doing, though, not only the sanctions as such that I referred to, but with efforts to curb Russia-EU cooperation in the energy field with these new inventions by parts of the European Commission regarding major energy projects and other projects as well. We have to face a number of restrictive measures in the trade and economic area. The Ukraine crisis, I think this is very important, was not the primary reason for this downturn in Russia-EU relations. I agree with you on that. It was much wider and actually started much earlier. I would describe the Ukraine crisis in the context of Russia-EU relations as a catalyst of those negative developments, not the baseline or the starting point. We had problems before that. I'll give you one example. We had this lengthy dialogue on further visa facilitation and in parallel on visa abolition. And according to my memory, at least 4 or 5 times, we were, the solution was within reach. We couldn't make another step without being there, as they say. And every time, the EU rolled back. Sometimes producing reasons, and in the usual manner, the Commission referring to member states referring to the Commission, and this merry-go-round continuing. But the result is what we see today.
The result is what we see today. Frau Gloger, I don't really want to go into the issue of the genesis of this whole crisis too much, and rather try again to look forward. There has been this idea floating around for quite some time that maybe there is a way for the EU and Russia to cooperate despite the current crisis in selective fields. Do you think that this idea is still valid, or has Syria, for example, proved that this is not really working, the whole concept of a selective cooperation?
Let me make 2 or 3 little points here. One point is, Mr. Ambassador, I'm happy that we agree at least on one thing when it comes to the reasons of the crisis, and maybe even a few other things. The second thing is, President Putin achieved some important strategic goals in his foreign policy concept and in the Russian concept of security at the borders. that we have to take into account, and this is certainly one field where the European Union or the West made grave mistakes in the 90s. I think we might agree even on that. So President Putin achieved a couple of strategic goals. Sevastopol, the Russian fleet in the Black Sea, secured for Russia. NATO membership for Ukraine, eternity. Strategic goal achieved for Russia. Ukraine, in a foreseeable future at least, will not become a member of NATO. Most probably even not a member of the European Union, which is seen as an organization of competition, of strategic competition in the post-Soviet space. Russia is back as a great power. Third point, intervention in Syria shows this. So President Putin achieved really some important strategic goals. And if we look, my second point, if we look at what's happening in the United States, very interesting result of this poll. When it comes to Germany, who should we cooperate with? There is no mention of the United States. I mean, where are they? Number 4, 5, 6, 7? I mean, this is really a change in perception. At least it appears so. So Mr. Trump is successful, so to say, at least in this respect. This should give Russia a strategic opportunity to establish herself as a new partner in selective fields. So it would be wonderful to hear from Russia, from the president, from the government, from the foreign minister, to hear some ideas of concrete cooperation, of fields of concrete cooperation when it comes to rejuvenization of the NATO-Russia Council, for example, in terms of security, military-to-military contacts, contacts in the fields of cultural cooperation. I mean, there's lots of things we can try to work on in selective fields, so at least not to completely lose each other during this long time of divide that we are facing.
Mr. Cimoszewicz, before we open this to questions from the floor, let me follow up with one specific question to you. Let's imagine you were a Russian politician and you would look at your strategic position as it is right now. So the grand realignment with the United States has not really worked under Trump. This is one. The relations with China may be closer, but certainly far from being very easy. So wouldn't it be a sound strategic calculus from your point of view to say, in this particular constellation, it would make a lot of sense to shift back and refocus on the EU, on Europe yet again?
You offer me a very exciting experience. Ambassador, excuse me. But okay, if I was someone allowed to shape Russian foreign policy, I would try immediately to cancel all the problems in eastern Ukraine. I mean, Minsk agreements should be respected. I should offer some more flexible position to find agreement with Kiev authorities on the rights of Russian minority living in eastern Ukraine. Crimean problem has become much more difficult, of course, because of political reasons, domestic political reasons in Russia. From the legal point of view, there is no doubt what should be the solution from the political, practical point of view. This part of that conflict should be probably frozen for 20, 30 years under auspices of United Nations or something like that. Then I would look for a strategic agreement with the European Union as a major economic partner. I would come back to the idea of modernization of Russian economy with the assistance of Western companies, Western technologies, etc. The situation between Washington and Moscow, the present one, is temporarily, I believe, in a little bit longer period of time, they can find solutions to tensions, to disagreements, etc., etc. What is probably the most urgent thing is to talk seriously about everything that concerns arms and control of arms. The most probably sensitive issue is relations with China. I try to follow Russian policy toward China, and sometimes I have a feeling that it is a policy between a rabbit and a tiger, because times have changed. This is not the situation from half a century ago with strong Soviet Union and weak, hungry China. Today, Chinese GDP is probably 7-8 times higher than Russian one. Of course, China has become an interesting partner for everyone in the world, so I understand that direct neighbors as Russia should be very much involved in strengthening, developing, etc., but remembering about reality. Once I attended a conference in Russia, and I remember a governor of Kamchatka or Primorsky Krai promoting his region, saying this is the region of the future. As I believe he said, 400 million people living in the area of 1,000 kilometers away from Vladivostok, but only 4 million, I believe, in Russia. So this is geopolitical reality of big part of Russia. A little bit more, but yeah, proportions are still
fewer than on the other side of the border, of course.
A little bit fewer than on the other side of the border. So I believe that Russia needs much more wisely balanced relations with major partners in the world, including Europe, including the United States, including countries like Japan. Because as we listened to a very important speech of Mr. Xi Jinping during the last Communist Party Congress, his plans concerning future of this country are very ambitious. And if in 30 years from now, this country is to become the biggest, the greatest superpower in the world, I would become much more careful being a direct neighbor of this country. Let me just conclude with a joke from old days in Poland. Half a century ago, there was a question what Poland should do in its foreign policy. The answer was start the war with China. And when the war is finished, what next? Start another war with China. And then the third time. And finally, why? Why do you believe so? Because Chinese army will have to pass Russia 6 times.
Well, that is a wonderful point to turn it over to you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.
That was quite some good advice, wasn't it? I mean, from...
I need to react on this.
I believe.
Well, let me start by saying that... Yes, but I'll start saying that not everything is gloomy on the Russia-EU front. We have excellent cooperation in international affairs. Syria was mentioned. Well, the EU doesn't play an active role in Syria itself as an entity, but still, European countries are involved. But should I refer to the Iranian nuclear deal, where Russia and the European Union are on the same wavelength, jointly challenging, addressing the challenges produced by others. Middle East, the latest events show that, again, Russia and the EU are, constitute together the more active half of the quartet. Of course, there will be competition. We live in a multipolar world. Competition is natural, both in the economic field, but also in the field of politics, and I would add, in the field of values. It's a world of competition of values. So if the EU finds it difficult to find common ground on values with Russia, which belongs to the same civilization, I would say, how does it plan to deal with others, like China, for example? On the advice that Mr. Cimoszewicz said, okay, Minsk agreements should be fulfilled. They do constitute the only basis for a solution of the Ukrainian crisis. So I hope that countries that were involved in Ukrainian affairs from the outset of the crisis, like Germany, France, and Poland, will use their influence on Kiev to actually start implementing the Minsk agreements.
And there is no role for Moscow here, is there?
Well, actually, Russia is never mentioned in the Minsk agreement. And Russia, together with Germany and France, were co-signatories as guarantors of implementation. Yes, on the same footing. On Crimea, well, consider it frozen, consider it solved. For me, it doesn't really matter. It's not an issue anymore. Unless, of course, you consider the arbitrary decision by Nikita Khrushchev in 1954 to have legal standing in today's world.
But not questioned by Mr. Putin dozens of years later. Yes. It was accepted. That was declaration by Mr. Putin that Russia has no territorial claims toward Ukraine.
Of course, we do not have any territorial claims on Ukraine. It's an issue of self-determination of the population of Crimea.
Okay.
And finally, on China. Well, I have to say something on China.
Very briefly before we go to the Q&A.
Sure. Well, there can be many jokes. There are jokes in Russia about China as well. I must tell you, yeah. The pessimistic one was that the situation on the Chinese-Finnish border is calm.
Okay.
But the positive, of course, dealing with China is not an easy matter when you have a population on the other side of the river, which is 100 times more numerous than on your side. You have to be careful. But we believe that cooperation with China, strategic cooperation, is actually a reflection of our approach to our multipolar world of today and tomorrow. So I see no problem in that respect.
Thank you very much. We'll have a full stop here and finally turn it over to you, ladies and gentlemen, for questions and comments. Please remember to introduce yourselves, be very crisp, and remember that any question, at least ideally, should end with a question mark. And Ambassador, you've been patient for a long time. You have the floor.
I'm Lithuanian ambassador. Mr. Ambassador, yesterday there were news about the launch of the large-scale LNG trade between China and the United States, about United States shale gas in form of LNG being shipped to China. Does that mean that Russia will be more willing to take over the best practices and basically the EU legal regulations on trade in energy and will be more willing to apply the principles of third energy package in order to, kind of open the way for new large projects which you mentioned of energy supply to Europe?
Well, I believe the third energy package is not a recipe for any energy problem or any energy situation. When we talk about gas primarily, the percentage of gas in Russia-EU trade volume is only 9%, whereas oil takes 34%. But there are no disputes, no high rhetoric about oil supplies, because gas is different from oil as a commodity, primarily because of the difficulty of transportation. One thing is when you transport gas through a trunk pipeline, as Russia has been doing for decades now to to Western Europe. And we'll continue to do that. That's why we're building Nord Stream 2. We have plans to expand the Turkish Stream. That is to provide energy security to Europe. Shale gas, which means in practical terms LNG, liquefied natural gas, is a different commodity. Russia produces LNG in the Far East, in Sakhalin, together with major European and American energy companies, and we export it. We're opening up exports to Japan, South Korea, ultimately to California. Why not? So if the Americans deliver their LNG to China, okay, well, we all know the rate of economic growth in China. They will need all the gas they can get through trunk pipelines from Russia, LNG from the United States, which will certainly be more expensive. Well, if they have the money, it's their problem.
Well, another voice from you want to come in?
Could I add
Okay.
two small points? First, Nord Stream 2. I think the position of the German government is quite hypocritical in that sense, declaring it a pure business thing, building the second part of the pipeline. Yes, you would say it is. I think it's a very political thing, and it directly affects the EU energy policy. So I think the position of the German government is quite hypocritical in this respect. What I also would like to add, you just said, Mr. Ambassador, Russia just needs to be patient. I do not think that time is on Russia's side in the long run.
Russia can afford to be patient.
Russia can afford to be patient, even better. I don't think that that time is on Russia's side in the longer term, because if Russia does not come to terms with itself, with reforming its economy, reforming its society, reforming also at a certain point its political system, which is most probably the toughest thing to do, it will be left on the periphery. In another very big competition we will face between the United States, China, and a strong and innovative European Union, because I think there I'm an eternal optimist that within the European Union we will get our act together at some point. It might take some time, but we will get our act together.
A very positive note here. In the very best spirit of Körber's talking to each other rather than about each other, we also have a representative of NATO here with us, Frau Papst. You wanted to also come into the conversation.
Yes, thank you. I'm Stephanie Babst. I'm leading the Secretary General Strategic Policy Planning staff. I must admit I wasn't really so, how to put that, encouraged by listening to you, because I thought much of the conversation that you had was pretty much a déjà vu of what we have heard plenty of times. So I would like to put a question to you which brings us perhaps a little bit away from this finger-pointing exercise that we continue doing also in other fora in Brussels. My point is, if you look at the broader strategic picture and not just look at the globe in terms of geostrategic 19th century competition, one of the drivers of change is technological innovation, in particular in the fields of artificial intelligence, automation, cryptical, currencies, and many ones alike. And if you'd look at where are the hubs of technological innovation, now and most likely in the future, they're primarily in China, they're still very much in the United States, and the European Union is also trying its very best to boost its efforts in order to become more competitive. Why should the European Union actually look at Russia? What would Russia has an offer in terms of driving technological change?
And that is a question for whom? Who do you want to? You want to? Okay, you go ahead, Ambassador.
Well, I believe it's in the EU's interest to join efforts on this with Russia, because together we will be much better positioned to compete with both China and the United States. And what Russia has to offer? Well, just look at the story about Kaspersky Laboratory. it's not without reason that the CIA chose to infiltrate its programming and pose a false flag operation, which has just been revealed by WikiLeaks. Human potential, my answer is.
I have a follow-up question over here in the first row. You have the floor.
Thank you. It's actually two questions maybe, and not necessarily follow-up. My name is Anna Sevortian, and I work for the EU-Russia Civil Society Forum. And Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned the visa facilitation and the visa issues, and we also talked about it yesterday. From the constituency that the Forum works with, we see young people and people saying, well, young Russians and young Europeans saying that Europe is where I am. And they can be based anywhere, very far in the Far East or, in the Western territories. In that sense, we've heard also that people feel, diminished in a way because of the whole visa issue and the borders being obviously very tightly closed at the moment. So what would be your suggestions? And that's the question for all the three panelists. What should we do in terms of visa policies if we speak about people-to-people relationships? If we speak about just a normal movement of people at the moment, what would be your best solutions, best ideas? And my second question is maybe to Ms. Gloger, as somebody who works with words every day, and that's about values and that's about interpretation of the results of the poll. I find it absolutely fascinating and, in many ways conflicted, the results that we got. And I think about the Russian part. My question is whether you think that it might be the language problem, this being disunited by the language and the language of, democracy, human rights being unfortunately compromised in Russia lately. So when we're asking about values, we might be talking about the same things, but the words as democracy, human rights, and others from the democracy dictionary are unfortunately not necessarily having the right connotations. That's why people are saying yes or no. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cimoszewicz, maybe I can throw the ball of the visa facilitation issue into your court and ask you to respond to that one.
20 years ago, when as Prime Minister I visited Moscow, I offered to Viktor Chernomyrdin non-visa regime between our countries. I simply do not believe in visas as necessary instrument of controlling the movement of persons across the borders. There are other instruments effective enough to know who is coming and who should not be allowed to enter somebody's territory. So I believe that visas in reality are not a problem for those whom we shouldn't like to get to our countries, because they find a way. Visas very often corrupt consular services, and they in fact negatively affect 99% of ordinary people. So I do not say that we shall not control the movement of the borders, just opposite, of course. That would be naivety to neglect that issue, but visas are not necessary. This is just kind of bureaucratic, traditional attitude, way of thinking, and this is not needed.
Frau Gloger, the issue of language.
I mean, democracy, as we know, is a difficult thing, and it was even a more difficult thing during the 90s in Russia, if I may refer to the word democracy, and it was very much compromised in Russia during the 90s by, I have to say, not by US imperialists, but even more by the own elites who talked democracy and did something very, very different. But the the word democracy for those amongst you who speak Russian being described as demokratia it's a very bad word, so I wouldn't rather try to translate it. Being described in this bad sense, I think this continued for a long time because it was identified with the chaos, uncertainty, and economical downturn during the 90s. Today, the rhetoric, as we know, and the propaganda, as we know, in state television still being watched by the majority of the people is, if I might say so, very much anti-Western. It's also very much anti-democracy. Democracies being countries and societies where chaos is reigning, where refugees come and gays can get married and so on and so forth. You all know the rhetoric, and it would be a very, very important step, I think, if this rhetoric would be turned down from the Russian side. This anti-European rhetoric. You've been talking about the anti-Russian rhetoric and hysteria, even. We can put it vice versa as well.
I think we have time for probably a collection of 3 more questions, I would say. I'll collect them and then throw them back at you. And Christina Callas is first, and then we have 2 more questions over there.
Thank you. My name is Christina Callas. I come from what I would call actually the frontier line where Russia-Europe meets. So it's a city of Narva, which is the most Russian-speaking city of Europe.
Right.
And I think this is where the European journalists all cluttered after Crimea because they looked at the map and got scared. But I want to actually bring the people's perspective into this dialogue that I heard today. It's a very high-level strategic dialogue that we hear today, but people in Narva is the community that is affected on a daily basis through this politics that goes on between Russia and Europe. And it's a very hurt community right now, in a sense that hurt for economic sanctions, that's one thing. Of course, Narva is suffering, but hurt also identity-wise. For people in Narva, it's extremely important that Europe and Russia are friends, because that's the thing that they need for their own kind of identification. If Russia and Europe are foes, that's very hard for the people in Narva to actually feel themselves worth or something. But what I wanted to actually discuss is actually coming from Frau Gloger's last point, the question of conflict of values. So the different wars that Russia and Europe are having now, the war on sanctions, the geopolitical wars, this is one thing. We can rationalize a lot of dialogues there, but we cannot rationalize the dialogue over the values. And I think this is what me, as a representative of academic community in Narva, actually hurts the most, is the conflict in values, the conflict about the questions of individual freedoms and rights, and of course the question of academic freedom and rights. I'm not saying that in Europe we're actually doing perfectly well with that, because we have our own problems with those areas as well. But among my students and working with my students who are 99% Russians, I feel that on the classroom, the biggest elephant in the room when it comes to the question of conflict is actually the conflict of values, not the conflict of economy or Syria or even Crimea. It's a conflict of values. And it's a hard topic to talk. It's something that people try to avoid because they don't know how to solve it, how to solve the conflict of values between Europe and Russia, especially the conflict of individual freedoms. And when the ambassador mentioned China, actually a conflict with China is there. I agree, the same conflict, but with China, nobody claims that China is Europe. So we say China is the other, it has a different values, but Russia is sort of Europe, but we have a conflict with the values there. And this is, I think, the problem.
Thank you very much, Christina. Point taken. Next question, I think Alexei Semeni, you, okay.
Dr. Alexei Semeny from Kiev. I have the question to Ms. Gloger and Mrs. Cimoszewicz, namely just bridging into the future. What can be done, really? Talking, and we have now two explanations of reality. What do you see would be possible in the future? Either to come back to the times when we do understand that we can reach any agreement substantial between Russia and the EU, so, and then playing, vice versa of what Ambassador Chizhov told, playing on time, but from the part of the EU, let's wait until Russia comes to some ideas, be it some values, be it reassessment of what had been done. And then you told Mrs. Glover that actually time is not from your perspective playing on the Russian side, so from this perspective probably EU should wait. Is this really so, or you should try to find some, despite not making business as usual, but some areas where cooperation is still possible or could be? And then the question to both of you, Mrs. Cimoszewicz and Mrs. Glover, where you do see these areas of possible cooperation, taking into account all what is happening in this. And short remark to what Mr. Chizhov told, first of all, if you would like to have a cooperation, not only with you or with any other party, cooperation starts with a trust. If you trust your counterpart, even if you disagree with some means, this promotes you to have this cooperation. But if you don't agree on the facts, you can interpret the facts in different manner. But if you don't agree on the facts, there will be no trust. If you're really claiming that there are no Russians in Ukraine, no military, something like this, the major audience just doesn't trust you, and then you stops any cooperation. And on the coup d'etat, you've told, okay, we can argue, but there is official medal made by Russians for 20th of February, so 2 days before coup d'etat, for liberation of Crimea. So operation started 2 days before you claim coup d'etat happened.
Alexei, unfortunately, we don't have time to go into that question now, but we have a last question here, the gentleman in the second last row.
Andreas Metz, I'm working for the German Committee on Eastern European Economic Relations. I have two remarks. First, from the side of the economy, visa liberalization, we are very much supporting it. And because it's a burden for trade, definitely, and so it's a field where the EU can deliver. And unfortunately, Poland stopped visa-free travel with Kaliningrad, so I think that's the wrong way. So we have to do more on that side. Second remark, well, maybe I stop that, but Nord Stream 2 is worth to debate 2 hours or even longer, because from the side of the economy we say we have good arguments for Nord Stream 2, and it's simply a channel where you can add cheaper energy. You can use that channel in the end, or you can't use it. And the risk is on the side of the economy. So, but I would like, I very much like that Mr. Cimoszewicz stepped into the footsteps of a Russian when he gave us some insights of the Russian strategic approach. And I would like Mr. Chizhov to jump in the Polish footsteps and maybe to tell us what he would do as someone from Poland, maybe.
Well, that's a wonderful exercise. Thank you very much. So we have a nice bouquet of questions here. Maybe I can ask you, Ms. Gloger, to start with a question about values. We talked about this a little bit before, but how do we deal with that absence of a common set of values?
Be patient. No, I mean,
Too much
very
consensus.
seriously. Come to terms with your own set of values and the problems we have. So redefine your own set of values and what is indispensable for a peaceful neighborhood living together. Don't think that this question will be solved on a short term or easily, because the reasons for it go way deeper and they are centuries old in the very end. So it will take a long time. Patience and calmness, I think, are some good tactical advice, at least. Ukraine, you want to hear Ukraine? I have a solution for Ukraine. No. Crimea, I think we need to freeze, really. It's it will get too complicated otherwise. Crimea is a frozen, so to say, issue. Sanctions will be imposed, so to say, as long as the issue of Crimea is not resolved. Crimea sanctions will be left in place as at least a small political reaction from the Western side. Eastern Ukraine, Minsk, is not the perfect solution. Minsk needs to be amended and needs to be changed. Let's pick up on President Putin's proposal on United Nations observers in the area. Try to work with this proposal to expand it so that United Nations observers might cover the whole territory at some points. To the United States, do not deliver so-called deadly arms to Ukraine, because it will not help to solve the conflict. To the European Union, put pressure on the Ukrainian government to come to terms with its, with its going into Europe and into the European Union. To the German government, be patient. It will be an issue of a generation. So I stop here.
Thank you. Ambassador, you were asked to put on the shoes of a Polish strategic advisor. What is your reading?
When I leave my government service, I will certainly try to do that.
That's too diplomatic of an answer.
Well, by necessity. Sorry if I disappointed anyone. Let me comment on what the lady from Narva said. If you heard her it's a reflection of that unfortunate, I would say, mentality persisting in that part of Europe, posing themselves as frontline to begin with. And then we, Europe, they, Russia. I understand the title of our today's conference is Russia in Europe. And I would say that, for all possible reasons, Russia, of course, is part of Europe, if you don't limit Europe to the European Union. By the way, what is the percentage of non-citizens in Narva? That would be my question to you. On trust, I agree, trust is a very fragile commodity. It takes just a little effort to break it, and much more effort and time to repair it or rebuild it. On rhetoric, well, whatever anti-Western, I would say if it's anti today, it's my personal impression is it's about 80% anti-American rather than anti-European. But still, it's a bland copy of anti-Russian rhetoric in the West. Russia has been blamed for everything, for American elections, French elections, German elections. Who comes next? Italian, next year. Actually, I joked publicly at one point, and I feel sorry for that today, because I said, well, the only thing they haven't thought of is to blame Russia for the Brexit referendum. 2 weeks later, a member of the House of Commons put a question and demanded a parliamentary inquiry into that particular issue. Whether that was a direct result of my my joke or not, I don't know. Finally, on Minsk, UN peacekeepers and on the issue of no arms to Ukraine, I fully share your view. That would be detrimental. On UN peacekeepers, I think the issue now is not so much where they should be, but what they should be doing. The Russian proposal was that they should provide safe environment for OSCE monitors. You know, when the OSCE mission was first sent to Ukraine, we supported the view, we as Russia supported the view that they should be allowed to carry sidearms. The OSCE rejected that on the grounds that the OSCE is not an officially, formally speaking, an international organization. And it's not an international organization because of the position of one single country, the United States of America. So this compromise solution to supplement OSCE monitors with UN peacekeepers, lightly armed, has been supported by Germany and France as members of the Normandy format, by the majority of members of the UN Security Council, except for two, one permanent and one non-permanent. The permanent being the United States and the non-permanent being Ukraine. So discussions are continuing, and hopefully that will be resolved, because their view is that this UN peacekeeping mission should be full-fledged, actually de facto occupation of Donbass under the flag of the United Nations. That is something we will not support.
Ambassador, thank you very much. Mr. Cimoszewicz.
One final
I think
word.
we have
on values.
Really
on values. Just
one sentence on values.
You know, in the golden days when I was negotiating a new basic agreement with the European Union to replace the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement of 1994, the EU delegation insisted on a reference to common values. I said, okay, give me a list. Well, they did not deliver.
Mr. Cimoszewicz, last but certainly not least, the one question that remained unanswered in our conversation was the one about selective cooperation, which was brought up again by one of the respondents. So maybe to end on a bit more optimistic note, maybe you could share your thoughts on the issue of where is collaboration between the EU and Russia doable?
First of all, we have to keep in mind history, and there were much more difficult and complicated times in relations between the West, democratic West, and the East, Soviet bloc. Let me remember the 70s and the conference on security and economic cooperation in Europe with Final Act in Helsinki. So it was possible to have a kind of dialogue already then. And I strongly believe that it is still possible to have a kind of political process, to have a kind of political dialogue. Probably the time today is not the best because on the one hand, in the United States, we still do not know what will be the real policy of that country. The promises are not being kept, sometimes very fortunately. In Europe, we have to make order to clean. Pardon?
They don't know why.
Yeah, that's right. In Europe, we have to clean our mess. We have to deal with many crises and unclear perspectives as well. In Russia, they expect elections much more predictable than in most of our countries, but still not encouraging to make big
Stability
changes.
at least.
And risky moves. So for next couple of months, I do not see any real possibility to do something new. But there are, of course, some areas where kind of cooperation, contacts are possible and are needed. And it is even not so much because of the substance of those contacts, but because of the climate, because of the public opinion, because of preserving some ability to stay in touch. This culture, this science, of course. If there is still any possibility of expanding, let's say, academic students exchange, that would be also done. When I visited this country in 96 or 96, I believe, and I met Chancellor Kohl. Your capital was still in Köln. and we walked in the garden of Chancellor's residence. I said that in the 90s, Germany and other Western countries should rather finance tens of thousands of scholarships and internships for Russian youngsters than to pay money to Mr. Yeltsin and his company. And that kind of seats will bring some results in the future. That is why I continue to believe that that kind of exchange, as intensive as possible, is in mutual interest. But if there is, Mr. Ambassador, we are talking really about very important issues, and I am a former politician who's still in service. I understand that you have to represent the official position of your government. If I was your boss and you risked to say anything against, you will be fired. So I understand some limitations of you, but we should understand that we are talking about the present and the future of our countries, of Europe, of Russia in Europe, dealing with global issues, global challenges together with Europe, together with other Western partners. Without any change in Russian position, without changing that way of thinking, understanding, that we are, for instance, not mentioned by Minsk agreement. Yes, we all know why Russia was not mentioned by Minsk agreement, but we also know who is behind the back of those rebels in Donetsk. And everybody knows what is the reality. So without the change, without more flexibility, without more openness on Russian side, I'm very pessimistic. But I really believe that it is a task for experienced diplomats like some I see here in this hall, with a good mandate given by political leaders, and the problem can be solved.
That's the perfect way to end this conversation, which, if anything, has proved that this dialogue on Russia in Europe is a very difficult one and a lot of homework for the diplomats amongst us to be done. Thank you very much to the discussants here on the panel. Thank you also very much for your participation, for actively listening, and also for posing very good questions. I think we all deserve now a strong black coffee, and we're going to come back to talk about the politics of history at 11:45. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.